Welcome to this meeting of Nordic Horizons online on Zoom. You'll see that the meeting is being recorded, so it might have appeared on your screen to click got it, and I hope you do get it. We're recording it because we do put highlights up as a wee podcast afterwards on the Nordic Horizons website. Anyway, to just cut straight to the chase, you all know why we're here. Our world has changed, and we're not even in the vicinity. The Russian invasion of Ukraine, when we decided to do this event, it actually was the Russian challenge to Ukraine, because before the 24th of February, no one was quite clear what the level of intent was. And now we know, now we see, now every news bulletin is a horror, and we're just the ones looking on. So this Nordic Horizons event takes on quite a different shape. Not just because we now have a whole series of issues as countries, as responsible countries, which you might argue the UK is doing better or worse at as ever. There's issues to compare with our Nordic neighbours, like treatment of refugees, like sanctions. But the really big issues at the heart of it is the whole question of security now, especially because some of the Nordic countries share a land border with Russia. Essentially, they all share a sea border in that the Baltic snakes its way up to St. Petersburg. And the security of the whole area has been called into question by the events in Ukraine. We have a very mixed bag, if you like, of Nordic countries. Sometimes when people refer to the Nordic model, there's a suggestion there's just one way of doing something. Tonight will prove, as much as anything ever proves, that that's not true, because there are different takes currently on NATO membership. There is different arrangements regarding membership of the EU. There are quite different outlooks and traditions in the Nordic countries, three of whom are represented here tonight, although I would actually say that pretty much all are represented tonight, because the speakers that we have, we're very lucky to have, are well able to talk about the perspectives of other neighbours. So let me just introduce them now, and we will hear from each of them in turn. First of all, we have Hans Mouritsen, who's a senior researcher in foreign policy and diplomacy at the Danish Institute for International Studies. And he's at the moment, he's researching the increasing importance of bilateral, not multilateral diplomacy, and the asymmetric relations that exist between great powers and small states. Divide and rule as a great power strategy. I'm sure you're getting quite interested now. This is exactly where we are in so many ways. We have also just had beaming into our lives with some relief on our part, Iver Neumann, who's director of the Fridtjof Nansen Institute, which is an independent foundation that researches international environmental, energy and resource management. Iver has had an extremely distinguished career. He was a senior advisor to the Norwegian Foreign Ministry. He was professor of international relations at LSE. And that was just after he spoke at an actual physical Nordic Horizons event in Edinburgh in 2013 about NATO membership. So that's almost 10 years ago. Perhaps quite a lot has just changed. He also wrote an article in a Norwegian paper just last week entitled "Norway Needs a New Security Policy for Security Reasons." So I think there's something new to be hearing there. Johanna Vorelmar is postdoctoral researcher at the Centre for European Studies at the University of Helsinki. Her primary research interest is in political language, trust, mistrust in international politics, the use of facts, and political rhetoric. She's chair of the Finnish International Studies Association, and she was editor of Politikasta, which is an award-winning web journal of the Finnish Political Science Association. And we have from Scotland, Lynn Jameson, who's Professor of Sociology of Families and Relationships at Edinburgh University. Her own research interests, globalisation and personal life, the environmental and sustainable lifestyles, European identity, and much more besides. And she is chair of Scottish CND. So quite a lineup there. And let's just start off then with Hans Mouritsen. Hans, I'm just going to ask everybody this same question at the beginning, which is essentially, where is your own country coming from in terms of its security policy, NATO and Russia? And has that changed in the last 2 weeks?
Yeah, it has. First of all, thank you for inviting me. I should say that. Thank you so much. A lot of things have changed here. There are emotional winds also are blowing among people, and with war in our neighborhood or next neighborhood. So I can give you a little anecdote. Just to show you about the sentiments here. We have in Copenhagen, we have an observatory where people can watch the heaven, watch the stars. And in this observatory, there's a new restaurant that will open in a week's time, and the name of this was going to be Laika. You know, Laika was the dog, the dog that was sent into space before Gagarin, and so this was all fine until a week ago, and then suddenly. And they had published this, the menu with the name Zyka on, and everything was okay apparently. But then it wasn't okay any longer. So the director of this cafe had to change the name from Leica because, as he said publicly, nobody will come and eat anything here if the name has a link to Russia. So now they gave it the name Gemini. So that's just a little anecdote to show you how things are, how the sentiments are here. I just shut my phone. So I'm back. So in politics, in Danish politics, I can tell you that we can see that politicians, you can even what to think about them, they have a sense of timing. I mean, that's their job after all. So they have just decided about new defense spending. So now we should spend the 2% of GDP, not this year, but from 25, I think. They've just made a big decision about this. And a second thing is the stationing of U.S. soldiers on Danish territory, also in peacetime. We had a decision from 1952 where the Danish politicians said no to such a proposal. But now this has changed. So now we can have American soldiers, equipment, airplanes, and so on Danish territory in peacetime. So that's also a new thing. And 1st of June, it has just been, I think it was yesterday or a couple of days ago, it was announced that we are going to have vote on our defense opt-out. We have as you may know, we have a defense opt-out from the EU, and if this should be changed, we have to vote about it again, and that will take place on 1st of June. So you can see the politicians have a sense of how the wind is blowing, of course, and so a lot of things have been decided here in Copenhagen.
Just to come in, Hans, just to give the picture for people, I mean, Denmark is a member of NATO.
Yes.
How long ago?
From the beginning, from 1949. So that's a quite old thing. Actually, I can tell you that in the beginning, the population was very hesitant about NATO because we had been negotiated about a Nordic defense union, which was almost coming into existence, but it fell on Norwegian assistance. But So it took some time for people to adjust to NATO, but today you can see the opposite. People are very fond of NATO, and very few people would like to leave NATO. So.
Okay, but this is a step up, as you say. Then, since 1952, there have not been physical American bases or troops in Denmark, and now there will. This is just enabling. Does that mean, though, in reality, there will be American troops in Denmark this year?
Well, not this year, but in a couple of years, that will happen. Yeah.
And then finally, this vote that you mentioned about the defence opt-out from the EU. What does that mean? I mean, what are you not doing as a result of the opt-out that will change if you go in?
Well, it means that we cannot participate in the EU missions, military missions, but we can still participate in the political side of it. So, and as you may know, Denmark has been active militarily in NATO and on bilateral basis. So it doesn't mean so much, but symbolically, it does mean something.
Okay, right. Let's speak to Iver Neumann next from Norway. Iver, can you give us Norway's position on security? Russia, you have a land border, and how that's changed. Perceptions have changed in the last 2 weeks.
It has indeed. Norway is a NATO member from the very beginning, like Denmark, but we voted no to the EU twice. So we're not a member of the EU, but we're a member of the European Economic Area. So there is extensive economic integration, but not so much in terms of formal political integration. There are, of course, informal stuff, and there will be bilateral maneuvers with EU NATO countries like Denmark and also the Netherlands. So this makes Norway sort of in betwixt and between in terms of security policy. And what has happened over the last few days is that, or the last few weeks, is that we are following Denmark, basically. That seems to be the deal. So, for example, we only started sending weapons after the EU had decided to do so. The government made an about turn 24 hours after they had decided not to send weapons for reasons of caution and prudence. They decided to follow the EU. And I think that was a political necessity. I mean, when Switzerland is sending weapons, as a NATO country, you kind of know that it's time to step up. In terms of party politics, the traditional no to NATO party has been the Socialist Party, which actually broke out of the broad church Labour Party on this very issue in 1961. So they have as their foundation no to NATO. And now they've started discussing it, and they just had their annual conference where they did not decide to go in for NATO membership, but they did decide to start a debate, which is quite interesting in a Norwegian setting. There's also a party to the left of the socialists that sort of grew out of the socialists' youth wing in the late 60s, early 70s, and became a Maoist party, and have now sort of toned down all that a bit and become a sort of basically a radical left party. And even they are talking about the need to stand up against Russia, and they don't want to join NATO, but they have been decidedly low-key about the whole thing. So if nothing else, then Putin has certainly managed to galvanize the Norwegian people. On a personal note, I may add that I wrote an op-ed the day after this started and said that we should think through whether we wanted to send weapons or not, because although it would be a very good thing to strengthen Ukrainian resistance and send a message against the aggressor, it would also mean that Ukraine would be encouraged, and we should stand by that encouragement, and not so that it wouldn't be a fair weather friend thing to do. And I was inundated with mails from people I did not know or people I'd met 20 or 30 years ago saying, this is really disappointing, and how can you? And we must stand up, and long live Ukraine, and the whole caboodle. I haven't experienced that before. So there's a groundswell in the country on behalf of Ukraine, which I find to be very interesting indeed.
So to be clear then, was your argument that Norway should be careful about handing in weapons to keep a war going that Ukraine looks likely to lose?
I pointed to the possibility that that might actually heighten the human suffering, but also that if we were with other countries in sending military support, it would be a different situation. The reason why I did that was because of the sort of immediate sort of gung-ho, we've got the Gatling guns reaction of the Norwegian people to this, which is a good thing in the sense that people want to stand up for the principles. But it's always a good thing to think through the actual long-term consequences of what you do. And I felt that there was little debate on the actual consequences of sending weapons. So it was an interesting experiment for me as a rather hawkish security person to do, you know.
Right. And then as regards Norway, you do have a land border with Russia.
We have a 196-kilometer long land border in the north, and it used to be the only place where NATO and Russia squared off direct. But that's not the case anymore, because with Russian forces in Belarus, it also means that that there is a direct confrontation along the so-called Suwalki Gap, stretching from Kaliningrad in the left and along the Polish-Belarus border. So we're not alone in having that confrontation anymore, but we used to be.
Does it give you any extra cause for concern, or does that particular border look like the least of Russia's worries at the moment?
At the moment, yes. But the job of a security analyst is not only to think through what happens tomorrow, it's also to think through the consequences a year down the line, and then also the accumulated consequences. That's important. What Norway has been trying to do has been to do deterrence through NATO, but also to, like Denmark, to do certain to put the country under certain self restrictions. For example, we don't allow military maneuvers close to the border in East Finnmark, that is the part of the country closest to Russia. We stay off that. We haven't had sort of troops stationed permanently on Norwegian soil, like the Danes, etc. These things now seem decidedly wobbly, and they've all sort of, particularly the sort of permanent presence, has already been sort of undermined. And again, there's a galvanization of Norwegian security policy behind NATO as a direct result of all this.
And one last question for the minute, Iver. There used to be, I understand, the case that nuclear submarines, NATO submarines, didn't come into Norwegian ports.
It was a don't ask, don't tell kind of situations. We don't know whether that actually happened because we didn't actually ask for declarations about it, but we made it clear that our policy was that submarines shouldn't come if they carried nuclear weapons. So whether or not it happened, we don't really know. So it is a very, very Norwegian thing to do, actually, to say, no, you shouldn't do it, but not verifying. Mm-hmm.
But then did that change with the period of Conservative government so that actually it was openly okay for nuclear submarines to dock? Like, has that situation now officially changed?
It's unclear. Let's just put it at that.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, let's speak to Johanna Vorelmar. Johanna, hello.
Yes, hello.
Now, obviously, you're the country with the biggest challenge with that long border with Russia, with your own history as well of almost so much of it must feel like a kind of, well, not deja vu for any of us because we weren't alive in the 1940s, or at least we weren't in the active war phase that we had in Finland. But can you just give us a little bit of your history and how Finlandization has come about, a catchword, if you like, that people may understand?
Yes, thank you. Well, certainly here in Finland, the war has caused, you can say, shockwaves across the country. You mentioned Finland has a long border with Russia, 1,340 kilometers. Most of Finns know that figure by heart. The history has been very there has been a lot of aggression from Russia over the centuries. There have been several occasions, most recently during the Second World War, when the Soviet Union launched a war, actually very similar to what we see now in Ukraine. And there's been a lot of comparison between the Winter War and this attack. And there are certainly some similarities, also differences. During the Cold War, as you mentioned, Finland was forced, you can say, to choose the policy of neutrality. It was a success story in many ways compared to other neighbors of Russia that lost their sovereignty. But what the price Finland paid was what is called Finlandization, meaning Finland had to compromise on its sovereignty, had to let the Soviet Union to sort of implicitly and also explicitly influence its politics and society. So you can say the Cold War, there's some traumas still in Finnish society. Actually, recently there has been a very widely watched documentary on the Cold War period, and it's something that has been discussed more recently, and this was just before the war started. If I say a couple of words about Finland's foreign and security policy, it is based on 4 principles.
Sorry to interrupt. I don't know. Hi, Mike Middlehurst, can you I don't know why we just heard you a bit there, just in the middle of Johanna, but if everyone can just keep their mics, I don't know how that did come up because it looks like you're muted, but if you can just keep yourselves on mute, it'll let us hear Johanna properly. Okay, sorry to interrupt. Johanna, take it away again.
Yes. First of all, currently, or you can say before the war, before Russia's attack, there were 4 principles that really guided Finland's foreign and security policy. First of all, close cooperation with Finland's Western partners, including NATO, other Nordic countries. Finland is not a member of NATO, and this is something that has been an important principle in the Finnish policy. Secondly, credible defense capabilities, including general conscription. Thirdly, active involvement in multilateral arrangements such as the UN, other international organizations. And fourthly, good relations with Russia. And now clearly the 4th principle, good relations with Russia, this is out of question. It's very difficult to see that there would be a return for a long time, which actually means that Finland now needs to really rethink its basic principles. And currently, Finland is, there has been a significant impact on the public opinion, also policy discussions. Finns have really you can say, historically turned actually in favor of joining NATO. This has been a major shift in the polls. This was there was one poll just about 2-3 weeks before the war started, and then another one 2 weeks later, and there had been a massive shift in favor of NATO. So now this is something that the public opinion is now looking actually similar to Sweden. There has been a similar change. There are also 2 citizens' initiatives on NATO membership that have gained enough signatories to pass on to Parliament. And this is something that they have to now take into Parliament discussion. The first one is demanding a referendum on NATO membership. The second one demands that Finland joins NATO without any referendum. So really, citizens in Finland are sort of forcing politicians take a stance, because this is something that there has been a very hesitant, very passive discussion on NATO. So all of a sudden, we see a very active, very open discussion on NATO. So far, if you look at the political landscape, there are only two parties: the coalition party, which is the center-right party in Finland, part of the EPP in the European Parliament. It's one of the biggest parties in Finland. It has been a pro-NATO party for a long time. And also the Swedish People's Party, which is a smaller party, but it's in the government currently, unlike the coalition party that is in the opposition. The Swedish People's Party is also openly for NATO membership. It looks like maybe the Green Party might be sort of changing their policy and might actually turn pro-NATO. There have been a number of Green politicians here in Finland openly calling for NATO membership. So this is something that is currently shifting. Also, there has been a widely shared sort of consensus that the defense budget needs to be increased. Similar thing as in many other European countries. After some serious hesitation, Finland did make a policy shift to send armament to Ukraine. This was something, Finland was one of the last states to actually make this decision, and there was a lot of public pressure here in Finland to do that. Many were saying like, oh, we can't be the one who doesn't do it. So there was a lot of public pressure, and then finally Finland did make this decision. But this is a historic decision because traditionally Finland is not this is it's in the government program that there's no armament sent to conflict areas. Major Finnish firms have now withdrawn all businesses in Russia. Sanctions are likely to hit Finnish economy perhaps harder than some other countries because there are a lot of investments in Russia. Many Finnish firms have investments. There's a very significant nuclear project, Rosatom-backed nuclear project that has been halted. This is something that was a big decision here, a bit similar to Nord Stream, the second Nord Stream project. So this is something that is not moving forward. And also a lot of active diplomacy taking place between Finland and its Western partners. For example, President Niinistö was visiting Washington a couple of days ago. He met Biden there. There was a lot of sort of publicity for that meeting. And tomorrow we just got news that the President Niinistö is going to call Putin. And he's now saying that we actually need to continue sort of having dialogue with Russia despite the situation. There's something that has to be done. I have to know that there has been Niinistö has been called a Putin whisperer or someone who knows Putin very well. In Finland, this is something that has been perhaps a bit challenged, this idea that he or some other Finnish politicians would have a special knowledge about Putin or Russia. And perhaps this has been sort of overestimated. And perhaps you can say that it's been there's been a contrary thing, that there's been wishful thinking about Russia's political development in Finland for a long time. And now I think many are saying that in Finland, politicians were not that knowledgeable. They were more sort of optimistic about Russia becoming more democratic and sort of turning in a different direction. Now, the very big question here is Finland's NATO membership. Some experts in Finland are saying that there are now active preparations taking place to start the negotiations. They are saying that first, what needs to be done is to secure security guarantees for the application period, because it's very likely that Russia would react aggressively to the announcement that Finland is applying. Other experts are predicting that Finland is simply strengthening its military cooperation with NATO and other Nordic countries instead of actually seeking membership. My take on the current situation is that it's more about strengthening cooperation in the area of security with its partners, but not actually actively preparing for a membership. But this is something that is now being very, very actively debated here. And I mean, lastly, I mean, you can say that there's a consensus here in Finland that if Finland was to join NATO, it would have to happen together with Sweden. This is something that has been in the polls. When Finns are asked, they would say that yes, if Finland and Sweden join together, then there's higher percentage for applying NATO membership.
Right, there's so much in there. Johanna, just one thing on the two people's petitions or whatever that are calling for NATO membership. I see that there's already 22 of these in the pipeline in the Finnish Parliament. Like there's a big delay because there are many of these citizens' ideas that are sitting before those two would be considered. And the thinking is that it might not be considered in your parliament before the elections next year.
Yes, that's right. And this is something, the Citizens' Initiative, it's something that was introduced not that long ago. It has been in place perhaps 10 years and is meant to give more sort of agenda power to citizens. And one of the problems with this institution is that if the parliament doesn't have enough time to take that into the parliament discussion, then it will not be sort of considered. And then when the next parliament comes in, it would have to be done again. So it's very likely, you are right, because it's only about a year left before the next election. It's very likely that, or it's possible that there's not enough time. This is something that has been criticism that it can also be used sort of, there can be some political motives also
but you would imagine that if even Britain can get to the stage of sanctioning Roman Abramovich and freezing Chelsea as a club and actually doing something, perhaps Finland could just pull up that referendum quicker than the other issues. I'm not suggesting it's a good idea, by the way, but presumably the National Coalition Party, the one that supports NATO, will only benefit in the polls next year if voters think we couldn't even get a debate about joining NATO.
It's very likely that the next election will be NATO election. So there will be one major issue on the agenda, and it's the NATO membership. I actually, when it comes to the referendum on NATO membership, I sort of consider that as not a very good idea for two main reasons. I mean, first of all, it's very likely that there would be some information warfare coming from Russia trying to influence the public discussion here in Finland. And it's one of those very delicate topics to actually have a referendum. So I would rather have if Finland was to join, it would have to happen through parliament, sort of taking that decision through representative democracy. Second point is that I'm not sure how knowledgeable we as citizens can be about all those pros and cons about Finland joining NATO. I mean, this is a lot about identity, as we all understand. It is not only about security; it's also about the very long sort of question about the identity in Finland as being non-aligned militarily. So I'm a bit skeptical about having a referendum, but I think the Finnish politicians in different parties, they are now forced to actually have a active discussion, regardless of whether the citizens' initiatives they pass to the discussion in the parliaments.
And just finally, you sound very calm. I mean, there's no reason you shouldn't be. But of all the countries that's sitting, the Nordic countries that's sitting very close to Russia, and the careful way you're thinking through how to make a change that would be seismic in your own country's history, and perhaps even question the wisdom of a non-aligned policy, which, as you say, has been successful for Finland, it would seem, for so many decades. It's like a bit of your identity could be ready to change completely. Maybe the Finns are very calm people, but it feels, it feels like so much is changing, and yet there's no sort of feeling of urgency or worry or fear.
Well, it's interesting. Now when I'm listening to the political leadership in Finland, the main message that they are delivering is to say, we have to remain calm. We have to remain very sort of balanced, not to start panicking, not to make any decisions sort of too emotionally. So I think they sort of find it very, very important to sort of deliver this message over and over again. This is the message from Prime Minister Sanna Marin, who's actually the youngest prime minister in Finnish history at the moment. She's 2 years younger than I am, and in her sort of rhetoric, she continues to deliver this message. Same with the president. So there are, the question of the importance of remaining calm is something that is really, I think it almost forms a big part of the discussion at the moment. Like, let's stay calm and let's just have a rational discussion on whether we want to, what is the best way forward. When the president was talking about his visit to Washington and when he visited Biden, he was actually being very cryptic about what they talked during their meeting. So many were asking, so was it about preparing for NATO membership? And he was just sort of bypassing the question and not sort of saying anything really, something very, very difficult to actually interpret. So that's why there's a lot of speculation now. What is happening sort of backstage and what is being said out loud.
Okay. So I'm just going to bring the other two speakers in briefly just to think about your situation, particularly in Finland. But I know this might be a bit difficult for you. Do you think Finland should join NATO?
Before the war, I thought that the current arrangement is good for the stability of the wider region. Now I haven't made up my mind yet, but my thinking has changed. And the reason why my thinking has changed is that my sort of image or my understanding of Russia's sort of actions and the willingness to act the way it does has really changed. Mm-hmm. So this is something, but I have to say that I would also consider the deepening and deepening of cooperation with NATO as also an adequate solution.
Okay. Well, just briefly, Iver and Hans, what do you think Finland and Sweden should or will do? Iver first. Or maybe Hans first, and I'm not sure.
I think Iver is speaking, but his microphone is
right, fine.
muted.
Iver, if you can unmute.
Okay,
sorry,
okay.
Sorry, Hans. I think we should keep in mind what President Niinistö of Finland did immediately upon Putin trying to talk about Sweden and Finland not joining NATO. When Niinistö said that this is entirely up to Finland. So the rest of us may have opinions, but it's extremely important to keep in mind that this is actually a sovereign decision. I've been watching. I'm a Russian speaker. I've been sort of researching Russia for almost 40 years now. And I think we are back to a situation of repression that is such that the situation is internally, it's in a couple of ways worse than it was during the Cold War. I lived for the first time in Russia in 1980. And then there, for example, if you were a member of the Russian Academy of Science, of the Soviet Academy of Sciences, you were fairly safe. Even Sakharov, when he was interred, he was treated with respect. The way academia is being pressured into signing up for the war now is worse, in my book, than things were when I lived there. So with that shadow looming, I would say that Sweden and Finland's taking the final step is long overdue. No, not long overdue, but is overdue once this war is on. And I must also point out that just like Norway cannot eke any closer to the EU without being full members, one could argue that Sweden and Finland cannot eke any closer to NATO without actually becoming full members. So that would be my line.
Hans?
Yeah, if it's the same question, there's a Swedish saying that says that sit down and sit still in the boat when the wind is blowing, and I think that is the line that both Swedish and Finnish politicians will follow, and I can actually see the wisdom in that. Sweden and Finland had decided to go hand in hand, as I think Johanna mentioned that also, which is a very wise thing, that if they join NATO at all, they will do it hand in hand, because you cannot have one of them joining and the other not joining, because that would give some unintended consequences that we can take later perhaps. But I would say sit down in the boat just for the time being.
Okay, well, let's bring Lynn Jameson in at this point. Lynn, are you unmuted? What do you make of what you're hearing here?
Well, of course, I'm a chairperson of the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, and our position is that we want Britain to give up its nuclear weapons as a part of trying to get rid of nuclear weapons from the world. And also, so we imagine if we ever become an independent Scotland, it will be a nuclear free Scotland. It will not be nuclear armed. And we would also advocate them not being in NATO. So I can understand why this is now a debate in Finland, and Norway are thinking about it differently too. And Finland and Sweden are thinking about joining NATO. I can understand why it's like this. But I would just point out that NATO is still badged as a nuclear armed state that has not renounced the first strike use of nuclear weapons. And that, I think from our perspective, is although there's absolutely no forgiving what's happened, and I'm certainly not making any excuses for Putin or trying to imagine that he's in any way reasonable or rational, the way that NATO has come closer to his borders is part of the backdrop of the tension and the continued construction after the end of the Cold War of an alliance that was as if in opposition to Russia, in a sense that he can now regurgitate back in his rhetoric and excuses. it hasn't been helpful. So the British nuclear weapons are in no sense independent. We get our missiles from the United States. The design of the warhead has to be in tandem with their design. The submarines that carry them have to be built around the missiles. The targeting is arguably possibly not completely independent, and it's a weapon system that is assigned to NATO. So we are, for all of those reasons, no fan of NATO.
And I mean, when you're hearing, however, what's the changes in thinking that are happening just in the space of 2 weeks, is there anything that has made you personally slightly stop in your tracks over the last 2 weeks about your position on this?
No, because what this illustrates to me above all is how much more dangerous nuclear weapons make the world, and how close we now are to a very dangerous situation. It makes me feel more strongly than ever that, we have a treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. We have I live in a nuclear state that hosts nuclear weapons, that has been a member of the Non-Proliferation Treaty for decades and done nothing but modernize its nuclear weapons and develop them further. It's already done untold harm. If you think about the harms that were caused by the nuclear tests, the harms that are caused by uranium mining, we've harmed people all over the world already. We all live with more cancers because of the nuclear tests. We can't just carry on with this rhetoric and actions of seeing more and more and more. We have to go in a different direction.
Okay, Iver, have you got a view on this? Because, I mean, in a way, Norway relies on the nuclear deterrence of other countries, maybe principally Britain.
Iver, you're muted.
Thank you for pointing that out. 2 years of COVID hasn't really taught me anything, has it? CND's position has been admirably stable during the years that I've followed politics, from the sort of early 1980s, and the question of mid-range, the deployment of mid-range weapons in Europe. And I think it's a principled position, and I have no comment, really.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and just to complete the suite, does Johanna or Hans have a view on this?
Well, I have to, if I sort of reflect on why there has been a very stable resistance in Finland towards NATO membership. I mean, this is part of the discussion. I mean, there has been a very strong sort of tendency to see that the NATO membership would bring with it the question of nuclear sort of powers and the question of sort of strengthening this logic of armament, and there has been a strong sort of peace sort of thinking in that resistance. Now, I mean, there has been a very strong sort of shift in this, and we have a research project on militarism and democracy currently, and my sort of I'm thinking that what we see at the moment, not only in Finland but elsewhere in Europe, is actually the opposite of this of sort of understanding the risks involved. We see an increase in militaristic thinking, and I think this is something that obviously we would have to also have very critical discussion about at the moment. But it's very difficult. I think that now the mood is going in a different direction, and I'm also a bit worried about this. About sort of, we just had a discussion on Monday evening in here in Helsinki, where where one of my colleagues, he's a professor in world politics, and he said he is sort of very worried about sort of we are starting a third world war, and that will involve or include nuclear weapons. And so, I mean, this discussion is on at the moment. Also, I'm not sure how to. I mean, these are very big questions, and something definitely that we need to keep on.
Okay, thank you. I'm seeing lots of questions coming in here. I'm just working perhaps from the start, which I don't know if that's the right way around, but it's where it's going. John Bryden, are you still with us?
Yes.
Good, John. Can you unmute?
I am unmuted now. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can indeed.
Yeah, I asked a question about, there hasn't been much talk about the European defence initiatives, but actually on 1st July, Denmark will vote on whether to join these. And my impression is that there is more discussion now about the Europe having its own defence initiative. We don't know what shape that will take, but we know there's a European Defence Fund, and there are European Defence Agency, and there is what you might call an emerging defence policy, stimulated, of course, by the present circumstances. So I wanted to ask the panel, do they think that is a realistic idea to take forward in future as an alternative to a nuclear NATO?
Right, that's a very clear question. Does any of our speakers, Hans, Iver, or Johanna, want to come in? And can I just lob in that there is also NORDEFCO, which is a joint defence union between the Nordic countries already. So could any of those be beefed up?
I can just note here that the Finnish policy has been in recent years, especially during Niinistö's presidency, has been precisely to strengthen European defense capabilities, and this has been seen as an alternative to NATO membership. He's been talking about this in numerous occasions, but realistically, at least before the current situation, this has not been moving really forward. So I don't think it has been a credible alternative. Now, I mean, it's not, I mean, John mentioned that an alternative to nuclear NATO. I mean, of course, it also involves nuclear states. I mean, if we talk about EU cooperation. So, I mean, this is something that I don't see that it would really go forward to such an extent that it would really, at this point, provide an alternative. Why? Because most of the EU countries are already NATO members. So I don't really, at the moment, I don't see it as a credible alternative. But from the Finnish perspective, this is something that would be the best option to go forward with the EU.
Brian, sorry, Hans or Iver, have you got a view on that?
Yeah, I mean, the big difference between NATO and EU defense is, of course, NATO has Article 5, which is it's not automatic, but it's a kind of defense guarantee that you don't have in the EU.
Hans, sorry to interrupt. Someone has got a very active dog happening. I wonder who it is. Is it you? It's you.
I think we should let Iver, and then I'll come back.
Okay, fine.
Yeah.
I think that may have been a nuclear watch, actually. But you see, seen from Norway, I mean, there is historical path dependence here. Norway's the lesson that Norway took away from it being occupied by the Nazis for 5 years during the Second World War was A, neutrality doesn't work, and B, Sweden is not necessarily to be trusted on military policy. Sweden, as a neutral country, was supposed to not let foreign military personnel through, but there were 2 million individual troop exports in and out from Germany and Denmark via Sweden to Norway during the Second World War, and Sweden pretended not to notice. And now, I'm not really sort of revving up a big attack on Sweden here, because in order to actually get by with the neutrality, they had to look the other way. But it tells you something about the viability of Nordics pulling together when it comes to defense policy. It's not going to happen. My worry is very different. My worry is that in 3 or 7 years, we will have an American president, the foreign policy agenda of whom we know nothing about. It may be an isolationist, it may be a gung-ho militarist. What's happening inside the Republican Party is leaving democratic politics behind. And with that kind of situation on our hands, the way to go is to strengthen EU defense policy. And it's such a pity that Britain left, because this is where Britain would really have had something to offer Europe. So there you have my sort of happening, as it were.
Right, and what a sobering happening that is. I mean, that's right enough, because if you're thinking about permanent changes, for example, for Finland or Sweden into NATO membership, you are accepting that the lead power of that grouping is the United States, which could well have President Trump back in 5 years' time. Horrific thought, but very possible.
Also very sobering, actually.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Hans, I wonder, is your dog under control enough to have a view on that?
Yeah, it's calm. It's calm now. It's okay. So what was the question?
Well, actually added to there by Iver, it was this question from John Bryden as to whether it would be better to go for a non-nuclear EU defence policy rather than NATO. Just there, the point was being made by Iver that you don't know who the president of the United States will be in 4 or 5 years' time. And that's the finger on the nuclear button.
But of course, that's a good point, that with the US is so volatile, and you don't know who's in charge next time. Perhaps it's the same guy as last time. So we don't know that, and we also saw that. Even during Biden, there was a lack of consultation between the US and the Europeans in connection with Kabul, the Kabul debacle. So of course, it's a good thing with European defense, but it takes long time to develop. And but now you heard the German Chancellor Scholz, who made a significant speech last week. So it may be developing, but it takes long time. And the thing about non-nuclear, but the UK and the French have nuclear weapons. So I mean, yeah.
Okay, John Bryden, do you want to just come back and have you got what's your own thoughts on that? Your own question?
No, I mean, I think we are at a moment when we should develop a European defense initiative. I mean, when Mr. Trump was in America, people were very nervous about NATO. They've forgotten about that now. But as you said, it is likely to come back at some point. We don't know when, but it is likely to come back. And it will come back more and more because they have stopped feeling so responsible for the European situation, and they want to devolve responsibility to us. And indeed, they were part of the force behind the original defense policy in the 1950s, if I remember. America was actually pushing Europe. It failed at that time. But I think that Eastern Europe is particularly interested in this, and we know the border countries are interested in it. So I think we're at a moment when that could see some light of day.
Right, that's a fascinating thought. And we've got another question. David, forgive me, Villegas. David, are you still with us?
Lesley, David would rather you read his question
Okay.
out, if that's okay.
His question is how does all of this affect the position of the Åland Islands, which is an archipelago that sits between Sweden and Finland? It's largely Swedish-speaking, but it's owned by Finland. And also, what's the situation with Svalbard? I don't know if Johanna knows something about this. I mean, I wouldn't imagine it directly there's any implication for the Åland Islands, except that the whole Baltic security is now, you're sitting with a sea that leads to a country with which, well, you're not at war, but which has embarked on this war with Ukraine. Does that change the nature of the Baltic? And actually, maybe I could just come back when you've, sorry, overloading this, but just a thought as well, because earlier we heard from Iver, who was talking about Kaliningrad, which was a place on the map I had no understanding of till I looked at the map and saw this exclave. It's like a little outpost of Russian control that sits on the Baltic between Lithuania and Poland, I think. And there was a commentary here in Britain that a possible endgame or purpose or strategy of President Putin was to try to create a corridor between Kaliningrad and Ukraine, which again places a lot of importance on the Baltic because Kaliningrad is Russia's only ice-free port. So it seems a lot comes back to the Baltic and safety there.
Yes, the question of the Åland Islands, this is something the islands, they are demilitarized, and this is something that, Finland is responsible for defending the islands, but militarily as well in the case of attack. But the fact is that they are demilitarized, and this is something, you can say some people here, some experts, they call it a paradox. How can you actually defend a demilitarized island when you can't really increase military presence on the island the same way as we saw with Gotland and Sweden? So it's not really changing in that sense. This is it's a legislative issue, and Finland at the moment is not willing to sort of open the question of Åland Islands. But from the perspective of the whole region, we are talking about strategically a very important area, and something that we actually might have more sort of focus on in the coming years if the tension is increasing more in the region.
Iver, can I put that Kaliningrad point to you again and just ask you to expand on that thinking?
Well, if you look at the map, there's Kaliningrad, and then there's Belarus, White Russia, and then there's Poland. So and next to Kaliningrad, you will have the Baltic states, and the border between the border stretching from where Kaliningrad ends and to where and along that, the border between Belarus and Poland, that is called the Suwałki line, and it's the new border between Russian armed forces and NATO forces. So if Russia made a corridor through that, it would link Kaliningrad to the rest of, to Belarus, which is effectively under Russian military control. And it would also cut off Poland from the Baltics, so it would make NATO territory non-contiguous, which would be a large challenge in terms of tactics and strategy. So that would be an obvious sort of Russian thing to do. So the Suwałki Gap, for those of us who've lived for some years, we will recall the Fulda Gap in Germany, which was sort of central sort of front line between the Warsaw Pact and NATO. Now the Suwałki Gap has become the direct line of confrontation between military forces on either side. So it's a place to watch. It's not necessarily the place to watch, but it's a place to watch. That's the basic military logic.
I wonder if you think, though, I mean, we're looking at what's happening at the moment. It would seem that the Russian advances are extremely slow or grinding to a halt in some places. Now, I appreciate everyone has an emotional investment in hoping somehow that this all goes wrong and that they have really, the reports of people deserting, of lack of good military planning, all of these things just bring Russia grinding to a halt. And I suppose people look at the size of Ukraine and think, how can any army occupy 44 million people worth of a massive physical country? And then you think, really, could you then think that Russia would try to reoccupy Estonia or Lithuania? I mean, is any of does this seem to you to be viable?
Well, we're now in the realm of speculation. So that's sort of the entrance ticket here. And I will answer your question on that basis and that basis alone. So Russia is now deployed so heavily that they cannot stop this without getting something back. The Crimea, the so-called People's Republics, probably a chunk of territory that would link those two together along the Black Sea line. The weaknesses that we're seeing are basically due to two factors, I think. One is that there is very sort of little what you call interoperability. It means connections between land forces and air forces, which is an historical weakness of Russian military forces. We saw the same during the Georgian War in 2008. The other one is that rumor has it, this is again uncertain, rumor has it that maybe a third of the Russian troops in Ukraine are actually conscripted, which is interesting because it goes against Russia's own laws, which says that you can't send conscripts abroad. So rumor has it that these people have been made to sign 6-month contracts before going, and that most of them, maybe all, had no idea what they were actually going to be used for. So small wonder if that would explain the very low morale of these troops. Right? A third problem is that Russia has a doctrinal way of looking at things, which means that when a conflict doesn't really go all that well, it's upgraded from local to regional, and the answer then is to bomb more. So the logic is a very it's a tankist logic. The more it takes to win, the more you will bomb, basically. So the US in Vietnam, in Vietnam, if you like, which is not exactly doing any good. Right? So there are a number of reasons why these operations are being slowed down. The problem is that they may not actually stop the fighting, because it may only make Putin keener on actually finishing what he's started. So however low the morale, however bad the actual war fighting, they have a hell of a lot of troops. Now, to your last thing about occupation, the plan A seems to use, if they're going for occupation, which is a big if, but if they go for occupation, that seems to be to send in the National Guard, which is different kinds of paramilitary police forces, 360,000 of them, and use those. So Russia would be very thinly spread, yes. So they would be taken up with all this. But so rationality would dictate that one would hold one's forces. However, there is also the military logic that you start doing sideshows. Again, in Vietnam, it was Cambodia. Right? And one of the places to look for first then would be Moldova, Georgia, of course, and only then you would start sort of the NATO thing. But I think the NATO deterrence factor is so heavy that that's a long way off. Sorry for being a bit technical and long there.
No, that was very, very clear. And just while you're just to finish that thought and to see what Hans thinks, was it the right thing for Estonia to do, for example, all the Baltic republics to join NATO? In many ways, we're hearing earlier, some think that's the excuse, if you like, or that's the enlargement, the encroachment across to the east of Europe that gives some sort of spurious vindication to what Putin thinks he's doing.
Well, I think in hindsight, it was a good thing. But the sad thing is that Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania had turned their back to Russia after gaining membership, because the idea was, before they came so far, the idea was that if they got the security of NATO, they could be more open and more positive towards Russia. You can always say who is to blame here, but yeah. So that's one thing. I would also mention, in connection with the Baltic countries, to add to what Iver said about the Suwalki Gap. There's also the island of Gotland, which is very important for the Baltic countries, because if the Suwalki Gap is cut off, then the only way that NATO can assist the Baltic countries is by having Gotland, which is Swedish, as you all know. So that could also, in the worst case, that could also tempt Russia to take, let's take Gotland so NATO doesn't take it. So you see, there's a tense situation about Gotland, and we saw that a couple of weeks ago when the Swedes fortified Gotland a bit. So all these things are connected.
Right, gosh. I see another question. What about the situation with the Arctic and the Arctic Council? In fact, I think the Arctic Council has just suspended operations because of Russia's presence on the council. So it's not clear what can actually immediately happen there. And seeing other questions, I just wonder if anyone wants to come on and ask them. So I don't want to put anyone on the spot. David Somerville.
Could I respond to
Yes?
the Arctic thing, Lesley?
Yeah, please.
So it has ceased operations, but and the chairmanship is for the time being Russian. But the Arctic Council, I think a number of countries, and certainly Norway, will keep on planning for the reopening of the Arctic Council, because it's too important and low key to be given up. So watch that space. There is another sort of interesting organization in the High North, which is the Barents Sea region and the Barents Euro-Atlantic region, where Euro-Arctic region, where Russia, Norway, Finland, and Sweden are cooperating, not only on a state-to-state level, but also on the local level. The basic idea when this was set up in the 1990s was exactly to try and insulate regional politics from state-to-state politics. And that worked during the Kosovo crisis in 1999. But then with Putin coming in and centralizing the country, it didn't work so well more. But Norway still has quite an investment in citizen-to-citizen relations in the High North. So that will not be given up easily. Thank you.
I think has had her hand up for ages, and I'm sorry I didn't notice. Johanna.
No, I just raised it a minute ago. No worries. I just wanted to say about the Baltics. We just discussed it before the Arctic issue, and I just wanted to. I mean, I've been following the discussion in, especially in Estonia, because there has been sort of a tense relationship tense discussion between, or sort of considering the Finnish policy on NATO membership and the Estonian policy. There's been a bit of sort of this I told you so type of reaction now after Russia launched the attack. Estonian politicians have been saying that Finland has been a bit sort of saying that Estonians are overreacting and they are sort of too almost sort of they just have too many fears about Russia, and those are perhaps sort of overestimated. Now, when you look at the situation in the Baltic countries, the fact that they joined when they did, they would not. I mean, now the window of opportunity for them would not be open the same way. So I would say that decision at the time to join was definitely the right one. It's a very different situation for them than for Finland and Sweden, because they have a different history with being sort of under the Soviet Union. Now, them following what is happening in Ukraine, they would have a very, very sort of insecure position. And I would say that, I mean, if we talk about land border between Finland and Russia, their position, it's something it would be very very different. So the decision at the time for them, they definitely, I think at the time they sort of saw very clearly how they can best secure their sovereignty.
Indeed, I made a small little film about Estonia. Was it last year or the year before? 2020. And we were there for their Independence Day, which is 24th of February. Everyone gets up at 6:30 in the morning. I mean, they're in the middle of Tallinn at 6:30, so they're up at 5 a.m. to get there to see their flag being raised at the crack of dawn. And I mean, we were quite surprised to see that very and somber but kind of celebratory mood was the centerpiece of it was a military march through of tanks from NATO right through the center of Tallinn. And of course, to sort of Scottish eyes, perhaps that looked a little incongruous. And we spoke to lots of the soldiers who were there, lots of the young Estonians, and certainly their perspective was that they joined NATO before they joined the European Union. I think just by 3 months, but still, it was so very important for them, and it might be hard for people who are further west to appreciate that situation that you describe. I have a question here from Scotty, who says there are reports President Zelensky has cooled on NATO membership. Now, let's just discuss this, what this potential best scenario is. I mean, I know this is, in a sense, a ludicrous conversation because we're sitting with a country that's being pulverized as we speak. And yet, what is the best possible outcome for Ukraine? It's not as if NATO is actually motoring towards wanting Ukraine to be a member. So Scotty is asking, do you think if Zelensky is not trying to become a NATO member, would that be enough for Putin? Would it also cool Finland and Sweden's interest in joining? Hans had his hand up.
Yeah, I think that's of course a difficult question. But if you ask it, I would say the best solution would be a Swedification, or Finlandization. But when I say Swedification, I mean Sweden's decision in 1949 when they were offered NATO membership, just like Norway and Denmark. Then the Swedes said no, thank you, because if Sweden had joined, then 2 days later, Finland would have got a letter from Moscow inviting them to join a military alliance with the Soviet Union, and then you would have a border down the Botnian Gulf and the Baltic Sea, a direct border between Sweden and the Soviet forces. So that was actually a wise decision by Sweden to stay neutral. One could wish that Ukraine had decided for such a solution, but that would also require, of course, that the Russians on their side should stop exercising with 100,000 soldiers on the other side of the border. So it would be a quid pro quo, of course. But that would ideally be the best solution. But it may be after the war events going on now, it may be impossible.
But however, it didn't look as if whether Ukraine wanted to join NATO. I mean, Iver, it didn't look as if NATO wanted Ukraine.
Definitely not. There was a long debate on Georgia in 2008, and Georgia was lobbying heftily for NATO membership, and it didn't happen. Russia was militarily active then as well. We have a bit of a problem here because the Western support is being offered on the principle of the world order that sovereign states should have their own say in their own, should have the final say in their own affairs. and that borders should actually not be violated. And this conflict, I have a hard time seeing this conflict being settled or being diffused without territory changing hands, which means that the actual principle on which the whole thing is predicated is actually, in principle, up for grabs. That will be the tough one. And seeing the Ukrainians sign away the two Donbass so-called People's Republics in their present form, or even with them sort of actually covering the whole counties, and probably even more territory, will be that will be tough going. So that's the thing. There was a question from someone about how to amplify sort of go-betweens, third state roles, back channels, etc. We cannot know this, but I'm quite convinced that these things happen as we speak. There is no dearth of third-part counties that are offering their services. Turkey has been hosting talks. Israel is there. China has chimed in, probably countless more. This is all good news. And what I would have liked to know, if anyone has heard anything or even a rumor, is how often does Zelensky speak to American authorities? That would be very interesting to know. Because at some points they look like they are very well coordinated. At other points there will be sort of changes of opinion between the two. How much of that is staged? How much of that is tactical? That's an interesting question. And as a social scientist, I can't look between the lobes, people. But that would have been nice, wouldn't it? Mm-hmm.
Well, there's a series of questions here. I'm just going to end with, because I realize you do all have homes to go to, especially Johanna in Finland, who I think is 2 hours ahead of us. So it's kind of going to be pretty late by the time you finish. But one question here about the Chernobyl power cut. Might it have effects even in the next few days? Are nuclear facilities being directly targeted? So that's a question about nuclear. Duncan McIntosh wants Lynn Jameson to give a view on this idea of a European defence organisation and whether it could viably be non-nuclear armed, even though France would still be nuclear. And just a couple of David Somerville's asking, how can voices for conflict resolution be amplified? I guess perhaps there's a point there from Iver that some unamplified voices in the background might be useful. But do we need to have people beginning to talk about conflict resolution? When Iver put his head over the parapet on that one, he had a bad experience. And let's just see one or two more, and then I'll ask each of our speakers to just pick one of these questions if you can possibly keep yourself to one. There's so many chat points here. It's very, very hard to kind of sum them up. China has the North as part of its Silk Road initiative. If it continues cooperating with Russia, will that affect its relations with other states? So there's plenty of points in there. Let's start with Johanna. Is there a point you want to pick up there from those that have just been asked?
There's so many good questions. I wanted to say a few words about these negotiations and conflict resolution. What we are witnessing here, and this is something that I'm quite worried about, is that all those possible compromises that Ukraine would be in a position to agree upon, they would mean that we would have to really seriously start rethinking the whole international order as we've known it, because all those demands that Russia is now putting forward, they all are really serious violations of the current international order. And I'm particularly, I mean, when we talk about Ukraine, I've seen the reports that perhaps they would be willing to say no to NATO membership. I mean, this would be a lot bigger issue than just Ukraine. We would talk about the whole principle of sovereignty being undermined, and I think this would sort of lead to a much bigger shift in our sort of thinking on what actually, what is the role of, for example, the UN and the whole sort of stability of international order. And that's why when we discuss here in Finland, there has been many who've said that, okay, why? I mean, the solution would be just that Ukraine, decides not to ever join, and the same idea has been posed in several discussions on a European level. Also in the US, this has been the sort of in the realist camp, something that has been proposed for a long time. And I would be quite sort of skeptical and quite reluctant to accept that this is the only way out. And the big question is also, would it actually be enough for Putin? I don't think it would be. I think there's a lot more that would sort of then, we just don't know currently. Someone was asking, is he a rational actor at the moment? I don't think we can rationally predict his administration's actions.
Okay, has anyone got a view on those questions about Chernobyl, about the safety of Chernobyl, these kind of points? And Lynn as well, actually, Lynn, let's come to you. That do you think there could be a European defence organisation that's essentially non-nuclear?
Obviously, that's technically possible. I mean, I would prefer to see a strengthening of organizations that are not military, as the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe was heavily involved in 2014, 2015 in trying to, in the failed Minsk agreements, but they were the only serious attempt, in a sense, to resolve this. It's, there's a lot of discussion about that. It's not my field of expertise. It seems that they were not necessarily completely well drafted, but they did involve all sides. There was discussion, and that was a European-wide security and cooperation arrangement that I would like us to be learning to be better at diplomacy and discussion rather than having to recreate new defence organisations, is my feeling about it. And just, do you want me to say about the nuclear, about Chernobyl?
Yep.
I mean, Chernobyl is not, well, I mean, obviously it's the site of the accident. It's not a live power station. If it were, then the loss of electricity would be incredibly serious, because you need it for the cooling. You both need it, to constantly pump water through. Most forms of power stations is an essential part of cooling, or even if it's gas cooling, as they are in this country. You need it, and you need it connected to a grid that works, and you need power to do all of the things that you need to do to keep it safe. There, I believe, as long as they can keep topping up water over things that are in cooling ponds, it's not immediately cataclysmic. But what, of course, it requires is a safety crew who are able to work, who are not exhausted, who are not bullied, who are not harassed, and can do their job. And that doesn't seem to be necessarily the situation that we're in. So it's not as if it's a safe thing at the moment, but I don't think it's the lack of electricity that's the major problem.
Okay, and just Hansen, Iver, finally, on any of those points that have been made. In fact, I'm just wondering, Dan, have you done a little kind of run through of the chat that I haven't gone through? or am I now stumping you?
No, I think you've summed up quite well, Lesley. I mean, there's a general debate, I think, throughout the questions and comments about, could the EU be an effective force by itself if it was to set up its own defence organisation. That's the central theme that's coming through, the relationship between potentially EU defence force and NATO. Okay. So Hansen, Iver, just those questions that still remain then about because it's not just that one nuclear site. Obviously, Chernobyl strikes fear into the heart of everyone with just one name, but there are other nuclear power stations. Do you think they're being targeted? Is that just part of the crazy collateral damage of this war?
Well, again, in the realm of speculation, the whole idea of using live ammo next to a nuclear plant is interesting. And it could be one of those flukes of warfare, but it could also be that Russia wants to send a signal that it's a bit high-handed about its use of nuclear capabilities. The assassination of Litvinenko was made using polonium, which is a radioactive agent. So, and Putin has actually threatened to use tactical nukes 3 times now. So this is what we're up against, and I can't say I'm particularly happy at the thought. Basic problem when it comes to the new European order that we'll see emerging now is that it's an historical normalization. The historical pattern has been that Russia has been militarily strong and good at disinformation and intelligence work. So many would see those as weapons of the weak. And that has been sort of juxtaposed to European dynamism in economic and political models. So what appears as military strength, I think, is a thin cover, a veneer over simply a lack to be politically and economically savvy. Sorry. And Putin hasn't really done much to fix his economy, which is the basic problem. Even a non-Marxist like me can see that.
So where do you think we're just briefly, Iver? Where do you think this is going now? Where's the war going in Ukraine? What moves could happen, will happen next?
If we're lucky, Putin has given up the plan to occupy the entire country, and will end his war of aggression by taking some territory and insisting on some kind of neutral stance. That's I can't see any more sort of positive scenario than that. Some people.
And would it help? Would it help then if that was to happen? Would it help for Ukraine to try and join the EU? Because it's not like the EU have fast-tracked their membership application either.
Well, van der Leyen have made sounds in that direction, but what is being said in a peaked situation like this may or may not hold up. It would be unprecedented, and particularly with the bad experience with UK membership, I think Europeans will think once and twice and thrice before letting a country in without making sure that it's ready.
Okay, Hans, any of those questions do you just finally pick up there? Hans, can you hear me there?
Yeah, I abstain. I have no more answers. So.
Right. Okay, that's very honest. Okay. Well, look, thank you everyone so much for just really broadening our minds on so many fronts tonight. Thanks to Independence Live that have streamed this out as well. To all the crowdfunders who've helped us put these events together. We will be having another event around the time of the local elections here in Scotland, which will be looking at Nordic models of truly local democracy. But for the meantime, thanks to all our speakers tonight. Thanks so much, Hans Mouritsen, Iver Neumann, Johanna Vorelmar, and Lynn Jameson. And thank you very much, the Nordic Horizons team. I would say safe home, but you're home already. So I hope that for you is a safe place tonight. Thank you.